One human, two alien sisters, a rescue in the snow turned into a battle for his heart. There are a lot of ways to die on an ice planet, but getting tackled by a pair of glowing, half-conscious fox-eared alien women in the middle of a blizzard wasn't on Noah's top 10 list. He had come to this forsaken corner of the Virelian expanse to survey a failed terraforming sector, not to become the accidental savior of two half-frozen extraterrestrial sisters who clung to him like he was the last heat source in the galaxy. The storm had started 2 hours before schedule, pounding down from the high Cirrus range with a rage that bent metal antennae and buried crawler tracks in seconds. Noah had been halfway through recalibrating a core temperature node when his suit alarm screamed a bio-signal alert. He'd barely turned before he saw the first one, white-haired and barely dressed in what looked like shredded fur and ceremonial beads, collapsing into the snow like a fallen goddess carved from frost. Then the second one appeared, crawling behind her, hair stuck to her face, eyes white and golden with terror and exhaustion. She didn't even speak before lunging forward, grabbing his arm, and rasping something in a language his translator couldn't parse, but the intent was universal. "Help us or we're dead." And maybe it was the hypothermia starting to chew on his brain, or maybe it was the fact that they were both impossibly beautiful and obviously not built for this hellish environment, but Noah did something he had never done on a job before. He dropped his gear, hit the emergency shelter beacon, and pulled them both into his suit's thermal field like a man possessed. They clung to him without hesitation or shame, one pressing against his left side and the other curling into his right, their nearly naked bodies trembling violently beneath thin layers of alien fabric and fur. Their skin wasn't human. It shimmered faintly, like starlight caught in liquid, and was cold to the touch at first but warmed frighteningly fast, reacting to his heat like sunflowers turning to light. The taller one had blood on her temple and her lips were cracked from wind exposure. The shorter one whimpered when he touched her leg, which was raw and discolored from early frostbite. He could feel their breath against his neck as he activated the portable shelter pod, and as the insulation membrane sealed around them with a hiss, the reality of what he'd just done began to sink in. He was now alone on an uncharted ridge in a blizzard, trapped in a dome no bigger than a sleeping bag, with two alien women who clearly thought he was the reason they were still breathing. And they weren't letting go. The taller one stirred first as the heating system kicked in, her eyes slowly blinking open to fix on his face. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when she simply stared like she was trying to decide if he was real or just a last hallucination before freezing to death. Then she whispered something soft, melodic, almost a sigh, and reached up to touch his cheek. The translator beeped uncertainly before giving him 3 possible interpretations. One of them was savior. Another was chosen. The third was mate. He hoped it was the first. He really hoped. The shorter one began murmuring next, her head resting on his chest, fingers curled into the thermal lining of his undersuit. Her voice was softer, more hesitant, but the way she looked at him, eyes white and shimmering, ears twitching slightly with every breath, sent something deep and disoriented pulsing through his chest. They were sisters, he guessed. They had the same eyes, the same pale silvery hair tangled with small crystal beads, the same faintly glowing skin that reacted to his touch. And now they were curled up against him like he was more than shelter. Like he was a decision. Noah hadn't touched anyone in a long time. That kind of connection didn't come easily on long-range planetary survey assignments, where you spent more time talking to autodrones than to actual people. He was used to solitude. He had built a life around it. But now he was in a sealed pod, pressed against 2 women who looked like they had been torn out of some ancient myth and tossed into a storm they never should have survived. The way they looked at him made the silence between their breaths feel heavier than any words. By the time the storm passed 12 hours later, Noah had learned 2 things. 1. Their names were Lyra and Zara. 2. They had absolutely no intention of leaving him. He had tried to explain that he was just a surveyor, just doing his job, just trying to keep them alive until they could be safely evacuated. But every time he opened his mouth, they tilted their heads in that same eerie, synchronized way, as if weighing the meaning of his words against something else entirely. And when he said he was going to send a distress call for pickup, they both reacted like he'd suggested throwing them back into the snow. No, Lyra had said firmly, her accent strange but precise. You are ours now. We were lost. You brought us back. You hold the warmth. We bind. Noah had stared, blinking. Wait. You bind? Zara, smaller but no less intense, had leaned close, her face inches from his, her breath warm on his skin. It is the rite of returning, she said. You touched us when we were between worlds. You wrapped us in heat. That is binding. That is bond. But I was just trying to keep you alive, he protested. Yes, Lyra said, touching his chest gently. You did. And now we live in you. Noah decided it was time to stand up. They followed him. Not like lost children, but like something older and stranger, like guardians or shadows. Wherever he went, they went. When he tried to leave the shelter to retrieve his equipment, they insisted on accompanying him despite the cold. He gave Zara his secondary coat, which she wore like a ceremonial robe, and Lyra draped herself in one of his thermal blankets as if it were a royal cape. Every step through the snow became a slow procession of three, with him in the middle, carrying his gear, and two alien sisters walking barefoot through ice as if it didn't hurt. The real trouble started when command called back. Noah, the voice crackled through his wristband. We got your bio alert. Do you require extraction? He hesitated. Lyra and Zara both turned to look at him, their faces unreadable but intent. I have two unidentified xenolith F forms, he said carefully. They were exposed to extreme conditions. I performed emergency shelter protocol. They are alive, stable, cognizant. But, they've formed a cultural attachment. Possibly imprinting. They are not hostile. But they won't leave me. Can you isolate them? Noah glanced at the two girls now sitting quietly by the thermal coil, fingers linked together like they were meditating. No. Not without causing panic. I don't think they understand separation. There was a long pause. We'll send a team. Sit tight. Do not engage in unnecessary contact. Too late, he thought, watching Lyra open one golden eye and smile at him like she'd heard every word. That night, they made him dinner. Not from his supplies, but from strange white roots they dug out of the snow with their bare hands, mixing them with powdered nutrient packs and humming over the mixture until it glowed faintly violet. He wasn't sure what was more unnerving. The fact that it tasted better than anything he'd had in weeks, or that they fed it to him by hand, alternating bites between them like it was some sacred ritual. Lyra sat close, always watching, always waiting for his reactions, while Zara curled against his side with feline affection, occasionally nuzzling his shoulder or whispering things in a language that sounded suspiciously like poetry. He didn't sleep much that night. Not because he was afraid, but because he was beginning to suspect something far more dangerous than fear. He was beginning to feel something. Something warm. And he wasn't sure if it was his to feel. The next morning came without sunlight, just a pale shimmer of high-altitude frost clouds curling against the sky like breath on a mirror, and Noah opened his eyes to find Zara's cheek pressed against his chest and Lyra's fingers loosely woven into his, as if the space between their bodies during sleep had been a negotiation he didn't remember making, only realizing now that he had lost, or maybe surrendered, without knowing why, and he didn't pull away, not immediately, because there was something in the warmth of their skin, in the quiet weight of their trust, that held him still, not out of confusion but out of something dangerously close to comfort, and as his brain fought to snap into the alert checklist mode he usually started every day with, Zara stirred and let out a sound that was neither word nor sigh but something softer, as if waking up next to him was not a surprise but an expectation she'd always had and finally confirmed, and then she looked up at him with those gold-flecked eyes and smiled in a way that made the inside of his ribs tighten like a ship hull under pressure, and before he could say a word, Lyra leaned in from the other side and pressed her lips to his shoulder, not a kiss exactly, not yet, but more like a silent promise or a test of what he would allow, and he should have said something, maybe should have pulled away, should have created the kind of boundary that command would demand in their regulation files, but instead he just breathed and let the moment settle. The reality of what this was becoming rolling through him like the low thrum of a reactor warming up, and it wasn't until Lyra whispered his name that he realized they had already stopped seeing him as a rescuer, or a temporary protector, and had begun to treat him like something far more permanent, more intimate, more chosen. And maybe that should have scared him, but instead it made his hands ache to touch them, not in the way of curiosity or lust but in the way of anchoring. Like if he didn't touch something alive right now he might float away into the white silence outside. So he sat up slowly, arms brushing against them both, and asked the question he'd been afraid of the answer to since they first collapsed into his arms in the snow. "What were you doing out there?" And Lyra met his gaze without hesitation and said, "We were fleeing, not from war or predators, but from marriage." And for a second he thought maybe his translator chip had glitched, but then Zara nodded solemnly and said it again. "We escaped the choosing halls of Velquar. Our bond was to be assigned to a male we did not know, one of our father's allies, and when we resisted they exiled us to the tundra as punishment." And Noah blinked because what kind of species exiled its women for refusing to marry? And Lyra answered before he could even ask, "Zarathian politics are ancient and sacred and cruel, and our mother died trying to change that system, but we survived it only because we ran, and when we were nearly dead we saw your ship, saw your heat signature, and followed it like a prayer." And Noah didn't know what to say because that wasn't the kind of story you replied to with platitudes or sympathy. It was the kind you just absorbed, letting it echo in your bones until it settled. And when Zara touched his chest with her cold fingers and asked, "Do your people force mating too?" he shook his head and said, "Not anymore, not usually, not where I come from." And the look they gave him after that wasn't relief, it was awe, as if he had just confirmed a myth they weren't sure they believed in until now. And he realized then that he wasn't just warmth to them, he was possibility, a reality so far removed from the rules that had tried to kill them that they were willing to cling to it like a new religion. And maybe that was too much for one man to carry, but in that moment, with two glowing survivors of a cruel system curled beside him like he was their last safe planet, he found himself wanting to be that possibility more than anything else. And as the hours passed and the storm Noah didn't sleep that night, not in the way people normally do, not with the ease of a man who had simply finished a long day and earned his rest, but with the awareness of someone who had just crossed a line he didn't know existed, into a reality that bent the rules of his training, his culture, and maybe even his sanity, because lying between Lyra and Zara wasn't just intimate anymore, it felt like being tethered to something ancient and irreversible. And as their breathing settled into a shared rhythm against his chest, something inside him twisted into a knot of curiosity and dread, not because he regretted what they had shared, but because he could feel it changing him, rewiring the part of him that used to believe this job was about observation and detachment. And now everything he observed made him feel something, and that was dangerous, and maybe even fatal, especially when the morning started with a low-pitched whine of an atmospheric breach warning, not from his shelter but from the outer COMM dish. And the only way that warning could activate was if an unauthorized presence had triggered the security grid. And as Noah snapped upright, Lyra and Zara moved with him instantly, like they had been trained for danger since birth, silent and alert, already slipping on the outer layers of their fur-wrapped garments. And Noah grabbed his scanner and stepped outside with a rising chill that had nothing to do with temperature, because 30 meters from the ridge, barely visible through the flurrying snow, was a figure that should not have been there. Humanoid in shape but too still, too smooth, standing in a posture too perfectly symmetrical. And Noah raised the scanner slowly, heart pounding, and the data returned in flickers and static before finally resolving into two words that punched the breath from his lungs: Dominion Construct. And Lyra swore in her native tongue so viciously that the translator refused to repeat it, then said aloud, "They found us." And Zara's eyes went white and glassy like she was remembering a nightmare she thought they had escaped. And Noah lowered the scanner and whispered, "You know what that is?" And Lyra nodded, her voice shaking as she said, "It's a retrieval sentinel, not for information, not for data, for us." And the implications hit him like a falling satellite, because if something had come to retrieve them, then someone had sent it, which meant someone knew they were alive, knew they had escaped, and worse, had traced them to this specific ridge on a frozen back world nobody cared about. And as the wind picked up and the sentinel began to move, not walking but gliding with an eerie mechanical grace toward the shelter, Noah knew he had to act, not later, not after asking for authorization, but now, and without a word, he turned back into the shelter, ripped open the emergency cache, and pulled out the ion disruptor he wasn't supposed to carry unless facing hostile xenoforms, and Lyra stepped beside him and placed her hand over his and said, "Not destroy, disrupt, enough to make it forget." And Noah didn't know how to make a machine forget anything, but Zara was already dragging out a crude pulse shield built from scavenged alloy mesh, and they moved together like parts of a single mind, coordinating their escape like they'd done it before. And when the sentinel reached the perimeter, it didn't knock, didn't scan, it just stopped, like it was listening, and then it said a word that made Lyra freeze, not her name, but a designation, voice carrier 37A, and Lyra whispered, "That was my ceremonial registry." Not even the royal court knew that name, and Noah looked at her and said, "Then who did?" And the sentinel responded as if hearing them through the wind, "Your bond is unsanctioned, return for reconditioning." And Zara screamed no, a sound that cracked something open in the sky, raw and primal, and then all hell broke loose, because the sentinel activated its tether claws, spinning bright violet threads into the air like digital spider silk, and Noah fired the disruptor with a reflex he didn't know. Noah had expected a lot of things when he agreed to go off-grid with two alien women who had declared themselves his soul-bonded partners, but he hadn't expected to be stuck in a half-collapsed underground relay station with no functioning comms, a cracked food synthesizer, and a sudden realization that neither Lyra nor Zara knew what a toothbrush was. And honestly, that should have been the least of his concerns given the sentinels still out there scanning for their biosignatures, but instead, it somehow became the focal point of an argument that started when Zara asked if she could use the strange little bristled stick he kept in his gear pouch to clean her tail, and Noah, already dehydrated, sleep-deprived, and halfway to losing his mind from the constant hum of the broken coolant fan overhead, just stared at her for a solid 10 seconds before sighing and saying, "No, that's for my teeth." And Lyra, ever the voice of mysterious alien dignity, blinked once and said quite seriously, "Your species uses sticks to clean bones inside their mouths." And Noah, already halfway through trying to fix a damaged power coupler, muttered, "Yes, we also use water to clean our bodies, not sand and glowing crystals, and I don't mean that in a judgmental way, but seriously, what is that stuff?" And Zara, offended on behalf of her favorite hygiene ritual, huffed and said, "The crystal paste of Zerathian rootworms is sacred and perfectly safe for dermal purification." And Noah, to his own horror, found himself saying, "Well, it made my arms smell like radioactive lavender for 3 days," and that sparked a whole new argument about cultural respect and olfactory differences, which ended with Lyra pressing her lips against his wrist and saying, "Then perhaps you need rescenting," and Zara immediately volunteering to do it, and Noah just buried his face in his hands and said, "Can we focus, please? The last sentinel nearly blew my leg off and I'm one lost GPS ping away from having my entire command history reviewed by people who think hugging is a security risk." And Lyra only smiled and said, "You are adapting better than we expected." And that was how the day started, with mild chaos, warm awkwardness, and the creeping suspicion that the universe had a very strange sense of humor, especially when Noah finally got the local COMM relay working again just long enough to intercept a Dominion scout drone ping, meaning the sentinels had recalibrated and were now within 15 kilometers. Meaning they had maybe 2 hours to get the power restored and reach the relay gate hidden inside the mountain cavern before being found again. And nothing about that process went smoothly because the generator required biometric input to restart, and Zara decided she could mimic his fingerprints using her tongue, which she insisted had adaptive ridges, and Noah had to physically stop her from licking the control panel while trying to explain what a retina scan was, and Lyra, not to be outdone, offered to override the security lock by harmonizing with the panel's vibration sequence, which apparently meant pressing her cheek to the interface and humming in a low tone that made Noah forget how to breathe for a few seconds, and when that inevitably failed, he had to crawl under the system's maintenance hatch and manually rewire the core while Lyra fed him instruction based on alien schematics that looked more like abstract art than circuitry, and Zara tried to distract him by asking what human mating customs involved when it came to presenting your scent, and Noah, with sparks flying an inch from his face and half his arm shoved into a nest of exposed conductors, replied through gritted teeth that no, humans do not usually start relationships by licking each other's hair or sharing sock lint as a token of devotion, which made Zara laugh so hard she actually rolled off the control crate and hit the ground in a soft puff of dust, and Lyra, not missing a beat, said then what do you offer instead? And Noah paused, blinked at the wires, and muttered usually dinner and a movie, and both sisters s. The transition through the relay gate was like falling through a heartbeat that never ended, a moment stretched into eternity where heat and light twisted around them, merging their senses until there was no separation between touch and sound, and when they emerged on the other side, stumbling into soft red sand under a lavender sky, the silence that followed was not absence but relief, the kind of silence that comes when you realize you are alive, truly alive, and not being hunted for once. And Noah fell to his knees first, the gravity slightly lighter than Earth normal, making the air feel like silk in his lungs, and Lyra landed beside him, her hand still clutched around his, her eyes wild with awe, and Zara followed seconds later, collapsing into his back with a half laugh, half sob as the gate behind them flickered and faded into nothing, leaving only the still hum of survival in its wake, and for a long time none of them spoke, just breathed, just existed, arms wrapped around each other like they were the only things left that still made sense, and as the tension drained from his muscles Noah became acutely aware of how close they were, of how every point of contact between their bodies felt magnified, raw with the aftermath of escape and adrenaline and something else beneath it, something that had been simmering ever since they met, and now without the threat of sentinels or explosions or Dominion enforcers bearing down on them, that something rose like heat from the sand, steady and undeniable, and when Zara looked up at him with wide eyes and a smile that barely masked the quiver in her breath, he felt it stir through his spine, not urgency, not even lust exactly, but a deep and aching desire to reclaim some part of his humanity that had been buried under duty and fear, and Lyra, still holding his hand, turned to him with a look that spoke more than words, a look that said I am still choosing you, and I want you to choose us, not out of pity or obligation, but out of want, out of need, and maybe because the stars above them were so quiet, or maybe because they had all just stepped across death together, Noah reached for her face and kissed her, not with restraint but with a kind of hunger that comes from days of silence and nights of trembling closeness, and her response was instant, her mouth parting against his, her fingers sliding up his neck to tangle in his hair, and Zara's breath hitched as she watched, then leaned in close and kissed the side of his throat, soft at first, then firmer, as if needing to remind herself that he was real, and his hands found her waist while Lyra's pressed to his chest, guiding him down slowly until the three of them collapsed into the warm dust, limbs tangled and breaths rising like heat waves off the ground, and there was laughter between the touches, the kind that comes when nervousness gives way to joy, and discovery overtakes fear, as Zara struggled to unbuckle his gear belt and accidentally triggered his emergency ration beacon, causing a tinny robotic voice to announce nutritional supplements deployed, and all three of them burst into helpless giggles even as Noah reached back and yanked the device free, tossing it aside as Lyra's lips found his again, slower this time, savoring the taste of sweat and dust and something new, something like devotion, and when their clothes finally came off, it wasn't rushed or frantic, it was deliberate, exploratory, hands brushing over skin like they were mapping constellations, learning each other not through words but through the slow reveal of shivers and sighs, and Zara was the first to press herself fully against him, her body warm and trembling, her eyes locked on his with a look that was equal parts reverence and fire, and when she straddled his hips and whispered show me what human love feels like, he didn't hesitate, didn't speak, just guided her gently, his hands firm at her waist as she moved with him, slowly. At first, then with growing confidence, her breath catching each time their bodies found rhythm, and Lyra knelt beside. The dawn that rose over the desert horizon painted the sky in layers of soft coral and molten violet, a quiet beauty that wrapped around the three of them like a promise they didn't dare speak aloud, and Noah lay between Lyra and Zara with his eyes half open, watching the sun rise on a world that didn't know who they were or what they had done, a place untouched by Dominion laws or bounty codes or failed missions, and in that fragile peace he let himself believe for just a moment that maybe this was their new beginning, that maybe they had slipped far enough from the grasp of the ones who hunted them that they could start over as something more than fugitives and ghosts, but as Lyra stirred and pressed a slow kiss to his cheek, and Zara reached across his chest to lazily trace the outline of his jaw, a sound broke the stillness that shattered the illusion of safety in an instant, not the sharp whine of scanners or the mechanical shriek of an incoming drone, but a voice, distant and metallic, calling out through an old COMM relay speaker half buried in the sand, repeating a single phrase in a monotone loop. Encoded message received, awaiting confirmation. Encoded message received, awaiting confirmation. And Noah froze as Lyra sat up, her eyes narrowing, and Zara tense beside him with a sudden edge in her posture that spoke of knowledge she hadn't shared yet. And when Noah asked quietly what message, neither of them answered at first, just stared at each other like they were calculating the exact amount of truth it would take to hold him still without letting him bolt. And finally Lyra said the words that twisted his stomach into knots. "We didn't come here by chance." And Zara added this sanctuary was always the endpoint, but not for escape, for delivery. And Noah blinked because the words didn't make sense, not until Lyra slowly unwrapped the crystal shard from its protective cloth and held it out to him, and the soft pulsing light at its core flickered twice, then glowed steady, and the old speaker changed its tone and said target confirmed, initiating extraction sequence. And the ground beneath them trembled just slightly, just enough to feel like breath held in stone, and Noah stood too fast, heart pounding, and demanded, "What is this? What's happening?" And Lyra didn't answer right away, only held the shard tighter, her face suddenly unreadable, and Zara said, "It's not what you think," and Noah snapped back, "Then tell me what it is," and Lyra whispered, "It's the last favor our father owed us, the only one he never took back. He set this place up long ago as a fail-safe. If we ever ran, if we ever needed it, this was where we would be found, not by enforcers but by someone even they fear." And when Noah asked who, the speaker crackled once more and said, "Designation Echo Unit 9, en route secure specimen, and prepare for memory sync." And Noah stepped back, shaking his head because this wasn't just a relay gate, it was a trap, not a Dominion trap but something older, deeper, something that spoke in the cold language of labs and observation rooms. And he looked at Lyra and said, "What does that mean, memory sync?" And her voice was low and ashamed as she said, "It means they are coming to retrieve what was taken from us, not our bodies but what's inside them, the imprint, the interface. We are not just daughters, we are living vaults." And Noah felt the air rush out of him as if the planet had turned inside out, and he understood now why the Dominion hunted them with such precision, why the Sentinels spoke their ceremonial names, why the enforcers had been willing to risk a full incursion just to retrieve them, because Lyra and Zara weren't just exiles, they were living repositories of data, experiments wrapped in skin, carrying genetic sequences or psychic blueprints or some kind of encoded memory payload that could only be accessed under the right conditions. And now, because they had come here, the signal had gone out, and whatever Echo Unit 9 was, it was coming to collect. And Noah felt the fire rise in his chest as he turned toward L. The fallout from the data surge didn't just wreck the extraction ship, it fried every COMM relay in a 10-mile radius and sent the Silver Woman scrambling back into the vessel with smoke rising from her fingertips like she had just tried to hug a live generator. And as she vanished into the dark interior and the ship stuttered and groaned and finally collapsed into itself with a crunch that sounded like a closing jaw, Noah just stood there, blinking dust from his eyes and wondering when exactly his life had stopped being about survey reports and planetary soil samples and started featuring psychic alien explosions, corporate assassins, and accidental revolution. And Lyra, still glowing faintly with residual energy, walked up beside him, swayed slightly, and leaned on his shoulder like it was the most natural thing in the world to nearly bring down an experimental memory harvesting initiative before breakfast. And Zara, ever the enthusiast for dramatic timing, emerged from behind a jagged dune carrying a severed drone wing like a trophy and asked with complete sincerity if she could keep it as a mating gift, to which Noah replied, "No, not unless you want it buzzing every time we try to sleep." And she pouted but didn't argue, just dropped the sparking metal into the sand and flopped down beside him with a sigh that carried at least 3 kinds of exhaustion. And for a long moment none of them moved, just breathed, just let the silence settle like a warm blanket thrown over chaos. And then, because the universe apparently couldn't resist the urge to throw in one last twist of comedy, Noah's emergency medpack decided to reboot itself and loudly announced that based on current vitals and proximity data it would now initiate trauma counseling mode, which led to a tinny robotic voice saying things like it's okay to feel overwhelmed or bonding under duress can create long-term emotional instability, and Lyra muttered, "If it doesn't stop talking I will dismantle it with my teeth." And Zara replied, "Not before I burn its soul out through the speaker port." And Noah just groaned and ripped the battery out, tossing the whole thing aside, and said, "Okay, we need a plan that doesn't involve talking equipment. ancient memory programs, or people trying to kill us? And Lyra blinked slowly and said, then we will need shelter, food, and possibly some kind of ritual purification, because I am 97% certain I can still feel corporate data ghosts in my hair. And Zara wrinkled her nose and said, you smell like fried justice and desert sweat, which I find intoxicating. And Noah said, well, that's great because we have no soap, no backup shelter, and if I'm not hallucinating, we're standing on what used to be a data minefield. So let's walk before one of these sand ridges decides it wants to eat us. And so they began trudging across the dunes toward a distant set of stone pillars that might have been ruins or might have been a mirage, and the whole way Zara kept asking questions like, do human males need sleep after psychic combat, or what temperature is ideal for intimacy in open environments, while Lyra occasionally stopped to hum at buried pieces of tech in the sand and once nearly fell into what she described as a resonance sinkhole that could theoretically scramble your organs and leave your brain floating in a bubble of regret. And by the time they reached the pillars, which thankfully turned out to be real and part of an old observation post built by some forgotten expedition, Noah was ready to collapse. Except when he did drop to the ground to rest, he landed directly in a nest of sandhorns, which were apparently some kind of harmless but extremely loud desert insect that immediately swarmed his legs and began chirping in a pitch that Zara claimed meant admiration, but Noah was convinced was mockery, and as he flailed and cursed and tried to brush them off, Lyra stood serenely by and said, this is a sign. In Zarathian culture, being swarmed by sandhorns means you have been chosen by the local fauna to become a story. And Noah shouted, I don't W. The stars had shifted by the time Noah opened his eyes again, a subtle rearranging of constellations in the deep purple sky that told him they had passed into another cycle, another planetary rotation, another day survived, and as he lay there between Lyra and Zara, arms tangled and bodies warm beneath the salvaged thermal blankets, he felt the smallest ache of something he hadn't dared to feel in years, something like peace, not the fragile kind that depends on silence or distance from danger, but the kind that blooms when you finally stop running, not because the world is safe but because you've found someone worth standing still for. And as the soft hum of ancient tech faded around him and the wind traced new songs through the hollow pillars above, he realized with quiet clarity that whatever came next, he wouldn't be facing it alone, not anymore. And when Zara stirred first, stretching with a feline groan and accidentally kicking over a half-empty canister of ration paste, she sat up with her hair a mess and her smile completely unapologetic and said, good morning, husband. And Noah blinked, looked at her, then at Lyra, who was still half asleep and murmuring something about starlight and stubborn humans, and he laughed, not a small laugh but a full one, the kind that comes from deep in the ribs and shakes loose everything heavy in the chest. And when Zara asked what was so funny, he just pulled her close and said, I didn't realize we made it official. And Lyra, without opening her eyes, said, in Zarathian culture you slept with us, fought for us, nearly died for us, and shared your emergency protein paste, that qualifies as marriage in at least 3 provinces and a desert moon. And Noah said, well then I guess I'm a married man. And Zara kissed his forehead and said, not just married, claimed. And Lyra added, chosen. And as the light brightened over the ridge and cast a soft golden halo over the ruins, Noah stood, dusted sand from his clothes, and looked toward the northern valley where the final relay gate shimmered in the distance, untouched for over a century but still faintly alive with power, waiting for someone brave or desperate or foolish enough to try it. And he said, so, are we ready? And Lyra rose beside him and took his hand, and Zara looped her arm through his other, and they walked together, not as fugitives or broken pieces of old experiments, but as something new, something chosen. And when they reached the gate and Lyra knelt to adjust the buried interface, she paused, looked up, and said, this one leads to an uncharted vector. We won't know where we land. And Noah said, good. I think surprises have treated us well so far. And Zara added, just promise me that wherever it is, it has clean water and no more sandhorns. And Noah said, I'll try, but no promises. And then the gate pulsed and opened, not violently like the last time, but gently, like a curtain being pulled aside. And on the other side was not fire or death but a quiet forest under twin moons, strange flowers glowing in the shadows, soft wind carrying the sound of distant rivers. And they stepped through together, and when they arrived, barefoot and blinking in the sudden green, the first thing they heard was birdsong, not digital but real, a sound that didn't belong to any file or code, and they stood there in awe until Zaris said quietly, "Is this what your world sounded like before?" And Noah said once, "Yes, before we broke it," and Lyra took a deep breath and said, "Then we won't break this one," and together they began to walk, following a narrow path between glowing trees and soft ground, and as they walked they talked about little things, not battles or trauma or broken memories, but about what they wanted to build, how they would find shelter, how they would share food and stories and maybe even children one day. And Noah told them about his old dog back on Earth, a mutt named Comet who used to bark at male drones and sleep in his boots, and Lyra told him about a bird that could mimic any sound in the mountains of her youth, and Zaris said she wanted to. The stars had shifted by the time Noah opened his eyes again, a subtle rearranging of constellations in the deep purple sky that told him they had passed into another cycle, another planetary rotation, another day survived, and as he lay there between Lyra and Zara, arms tangled and bodies warm beneath the salvaged thermal blankets, he felt the smallest ache of something he hadn't dared to feel in years, something like peace, not the fragile kind that depends on silence or distance from danger, but the kind that blooms when you finally stop running, not because the world is safe but because you've found someone worth standing still for. And as the soft hum of ancient tech faded around him and the wind traced new songs through the hollow pillars above, he realized with quiet clarity that whatever came next, he wouldn't be facing it alone, not anymore. And when Zara stirred first, stretching with a feline groan and accidentally kicking over a half-empty canister of ration paste, she sat up with her hair a mess and her smile completely unapologetic and said, "Good morning, husband." And Noah blinked, looked at her, then at Lyra who was still half asleep and murmuring something about starlight and stubborn humans, and he laughed, not a small laugh but a full one, the kind that comes from deep in the ribs and shakes loose everything heavy in the chest. And when Zara asked what was so funny, he just pulled her close and said, "I didn't realize we made it official." And Lyra, without opening her eyes, said, "In Zarathian culture you slept with us, fought for us, nearly died for us, and shared your emergency protein paste, that qualifies as marriage in at least 3 provinces and a desert moon." And Noah said, "Well then I guess I'm a married man." And Zara kissed his forehead and said, "Not just married, claimed." And Lyra added, "Chosen." And as the light brightened over the ridge and cast a soft golden halo over the ruins, Noah stood, dusted sand from his clothes, and looked toward the northern valley where the final relay gate shimmered in the distance, untouched for over a century but still faintly alive with power, waiting for someone brave or desperate or foolish enough to try it. And he said, "So, are we ready?" And Lyra rose beside him and took his hand, and Zara looped her arm through his other, and they walked together, not as fugitives or broken pieces of old experiments, but as something new, something chosen. And when they reached the gate and Lyra knelt to adjust the buried interface, she paused, looked up, and said, "This one leads to an uncharted vector. We won't know where we land." And Noah said, "Good. I think surprises have treated us well so far." And Zara added, "Just promise me that wherever it is, it has clean water and no more sandhorns." And Noah said, "I'll try, but no promises." And then the gate pulsed and opened, not violently like the last time, but gently, like a curtain being pulled aside, and on the other side was not fire or death but a quiet forest under twin moons, strange flowers glowing in the shadows, soft wind carrying the sound of distant rivers, and they stepped through together. And when they arrived, barefoot and blinking in the sudden green, the first thing they heard was bird song, not digital but real, a sound that didn't belong to any file or code. And they stood there in awe until Zara said quietly, "Is this what your world sounded like before?" And Noah said once, "Yes, before we broke it," and Lyra took a deep breath and said, "Then we won't break this one." And together they began to walk, following a narrow path between glowing trees and soft ground, and as they walked they talked about little things, not battles or trauma or broken memories, but about what they wanted to build, how they would find shelter, how they would share food and stories and maybe even children one day. And Noah told them about his old dog back on Earth, a mutt named Comet who used to bark at male drones and sleep in his boots, and Lyra told him about a bird that could mimic any sound in the mountains of her youth, and Zara said she wanted to.